The wind howled its familiar lament across the remote mountain pass, a constant, abrasive whisper against the thick glass of my observatory dome. It had been my only companion for years, that wind, alongside the ceaseless thrum of the servers and the soft, rhythmic blink of indicator lights. Up here, perched on the highest accessible ridge, the stars felt closer, sharper, less like distant pinpricks and more like watchful eyes. My world was a contained bubble of metal, wires, and the chilling vacuum of space outside. I ran a hand through my perpetually disheveled hair, the scent of stale coffee clinging to my sleeves. Another night, another cycle of data sifting. Most people saw the universe as a grand, silent expanse, but I knew better. It was a cacophony, a constant, churning storm of energy, radiation, and background noise. My work, my obsession, was to find the patterns in the chaos, to listen for the voices that weren't supposed to be there. I'd built this place, piece by painstaking piece, funded by a series of increasingly bewildered grants and my own rapidly dwindling savings, all for the singular purpose of proving that the universe wasn't as empty as it seemed. My custom algorithms, intricate webs of mathematical logic woven over years of solitary nights, hummed away on a bank of specialized processors. They were designed to discard the known, the pulsars, the quasars, the cosmic background radiation, the gravitational lensing signatures. I wasn't looking for anomalies within established physics. I was searching for the impossible, a signal that defied classification, a pattern that spoke of intent beyond any natural phenomenon. My colleagues back in the lowlands had called it a fool's errand, a descent into fringe science. I called it truth. The only sound beyond the wind and the machines was the occasional creak of the building settling or the rustle of my own movements. I lived on instant meals and the raw, unyielding determination that fueled my quest. My fingers danced across the console, adjusting parameters, refining filters, my eyes scanning the real-time spectral analysis. Millions of data points streamed past, an endless river of information, each one screaming its natural origin. Until it wasn't. It started subtly, a barely perceptible ripple in the deepest band of the ultra-low frequency spectrum, a region I'd always considered too noisy, too chaotic to yield anything coherent. My dedicated anomaly detection subroutine, a neural net I'd coded to recognize deviations from randomness at an almost intuitive level, flagged it. A faint, persistent flicker in the corner of my primary display. It wasn't a burst, not a transient event. It was sustained. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. My heart gave a sudden, hard thump against my ribs, a sensation I'd almost forgotten. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't interference. The pattern forming on the screen was too structured, too intricate. It was a perfect fractal recursion, each segment containing the entirety of the preceding one, yet subtly altered, evolving. My voice was hoarse, unused. No, this can't be. I cross-referenced the data with every known cosmic signature, every terrestrial source, every theoretical possibility I'd ever entertained. Nothing matched, not even close. This signal was entirely new. It was a perfect, ordered stream of information, yet its fundamental architecture defied every principle of information theory I knew. It was impossibly complex, a tapestry woven from threads that didn't exist in our universe. A surge of pure, unadulterated elation coursed through me, a dizzying rush of vindication. Years of isolation, of doubt, of ridicule, all of it washed away in this single, undeniable moment. I had found it, the impossible, the proof. My hands flew across the keyboard, isolating the signal, running it through every diagnostic and analytical tool I possessed. The signal wasn't just complex, it was intelligent, not in a simplistic, binary sense, but with a depth of structure that hinted at profound, ancient thought. It wasn't just sending data, it felt like it was thinking in data. I pushed my chair back, the plastic wheels squeaking against the polished floor. My eyes, still glued to the screen, traced the unfolding patterns. They were beautiful, mesmerizing, like gazing into a kaleidoscope that endlessly generated new, interconnected symmetries. But as I watched, a strange sensation crept over me. It felt less like I was observing a transmission, and more like I was being observed. The patterns on the screen seemed to shift, to subtly reconfigure themselves, not randomly, but in response to my analysis. It was as if the signal was not merely a broadcast, but a dialogue or perhaps a reflection. The initial excitement was now overshadowed by a profound sense of unease. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an encounter. An entity existing as pure information, reaching out from beyond the known. And as I stared into the intricate, impossible depths of its message, I felt a faint, cold whisper in the back of my mind, a thought that wasn't my own, resonating with the very structure of the signal. You have been found. The air in my small laboratory, perched precariously on the side of the remote mountain pass, had grown thick, not with dust or the scent of pine, but with a different kind of density. Days blurred into a single, continuous stretch of glowing screens and the low hum of equipment. I hadn't slept properly in what felt like weeks, sustained only by a relentless, burning curiosity. The signal. It pulsed in my mind even when the monitors were off, a phantom echo of its intricate architecture. I leaned back in my chair, the worn leather groaning under my weight, and rubbed my temples. My eyes burned, the edges of my vision starting to fray. I saw fleeting shadows in the corners, quick as a startled bird, but when I turned my head, there was nothing but the familiar, cluttered shelves of data drives and the stark, unyielding rock face visible through the reinforced window. The silence of the remote mountain pass was usually absolute, a comforting blanket against the cacophony of the world below. Now it felt like a pressure, a vacuum waiting to be filled. My fingers, calloused from countless hours manipulating controls, hovered over the console. The latest iteration of my decoding algorithm was running, a desperate attempt to peel back another layer of the alien data. Every line of code, every mathematical operation, every logical gate I threw at it seemed to splinter against the signal's impossible complexity. It was like trying to understand a language composed of colors and emotions without a single common reference point. Yet there was an undeniable coherence to it, a terrifying beauty that drew me deeper. A faint, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the speakers, a sound I hadn't programmed. It wasn't the usual static hiss, nor the rhythmic pulse of the signal itself. This was a thin, reedy note that seemed to vibrate in my bones, not just my ears. I reached for the volume, but my hand paused. It wasn't coming from the speakers at all. It was everywhere. The very air in the lab seemed to shimmer with the sound. The metal casing of my primary receiver seemed to hum in sympathy, though its diagnostic lights showed no anomaly. I shook my head, convinced it was auditory fatigue, a byproduct of too much caffeine and too little sleep. "Just your mind playing tricks, Kai," I mumbled, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet. The sound persisted, a needle-thin thread of dissonance. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands into them until stars exploded behind my eyelids. When I opened them, the hum was gone, or perhaps I had simply grown accustomed to it. The isolation of the remote mountain pass was usually a strength, a sanctuary for my work. Now it felt like a cage. My phone had buzzed intermittently over the last few days, notifications from a colleague in the lowlands, likely asking about progress or simply checking in. I'd ignored them all. Every interaction felt like a distraction, a pulling away from the singular, all-consuming focus of the signal. Their voices, their mundane concerns, would only muddy the clear, cold waters of my obsession. I needed to be alone with this, to wrestle it into submission, or perhaps to be submitted by it. The text on my monitors, usually crisp and defined, occasionally seemed to waver, the individual characters elongating or shrinking for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. It was like watching water ripple over submerged stones. I blinked, rubbed my eyes again, even adjusted my glasses. No, it wasn't the screens. It was my perception of them. It wasn't a physical temperature drop. The lab's climate control was functioning perfectly. I stood up, needing to move to break the spell. My legs felt heavy like lead. I walked to the window, gazing out at the rugged peaks of the remote mountain pass, stark against a bruised twilight sky. The familiar landscape, usually a source of calm, now seemed to twist and writhe. The jagged ridges of the distant mountains appeared to undulate, their sharp profiles softening and then hardening again, as if the very rock was breathing. The twilight itself seemed to pulse, the blues and purples deepening and then lightening in an unnatural rhythm, completely divorced from the slow, steady descent of the sun. My breath hitched. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a trick of the light. The world outside, the solid, immutable world I had always known, was shifting. My perception wasn't merely distorted. It was being actively rewritten. It was doing this. It was reaching beyond the screens, beyond my ears, beyond my eyes, and into the very fabric of my reality. It wasn't a language I understood, not a sequence of sounds I could parse, but the meaning was undeniable. It was a question, and the question was about my comprehension. It asked if I understood what I was seeing, what I was becoming. I spun around, my heart racing, searching the empty lab. Nothing. No intruder. The hum returned, louder now, a low thrum that vibrated in my teeth. The lines of the remote mountain pass outside continued to warp, a silent, cosmic scream. I was no longer merely observing the signal. I was becoming part of its impossible broadcast, and it was just beginning to tune into me. I hadn't slept properly in what felt like a lifetime, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate, almost manic determination. My eyes, gritty and bloodshot, traced the complex waveforms scrolling across my primary monitor. The anomalous cosmic signal, my obsession, had become a living thing in my perception, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of my thoughts. I was chasing a pattern, a recursive anomaly within the signal's structure that defied every known principle of information theory. It wasn't merely complex, it was too complex, a labyrinthine architecture that shifted and reconfigured itself as I analyzed it. My fingers flew across the holographic interface, manipulating algorithms, filtering noise, trying to peel back the layers of what I still believed was an incredibly sophisticated message. Then a flicker, not on the screen but in the periphery of my vision, a shadow that wasn't there when I turned my head. My breath hitched. I leaned closer to the console, pushing aside the empty mugs and discarded wrappers. The recursive anomaly, which I'd been trying to isolate for weeks, suddenly resolved. It wasn't a pattern in the traditional sense. It was a loop, yes, but a loop that fed back into itself, not to repeat, but to evolve. Each cycle wasn't a replication, it was a modification, a subtle alteration that built upon the last. My mind reeled. Data doesn't evolve. Code can be written to adapt, but this felt different. This felt biological. I stared, my heart racing, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the mountain pass. I ran the analysis again, then a third time, each pass confirming the impossible. The signal wasn't transmitting information. It was processing it internally within its own structure. It wasn't a message from something. It was something. The hum of the equipment seemed to deepen, to resonate not just in the room but within my very skull. This wasn't data. This was a presence. A sentient, ancient consciousness woven into the fabric of the cosmos, broadcasting itself not as a series of instructions, but as a living, breathing entity. I had been so focused on deciphering, I hadn't considered the possibility of encountering. And then it began. Not a voice, not a vision, but a sudden, overwhelming influx of understanding. It wasn't information I read or heard. It was knowledge directly infused into my consciousness, bypassing my senses, bypassing my rational mind. It felt like a dam had burst, and an ocean of alien truth was pouring into the confines of my skull. The universe, as I understood it, was a child's drawing. The fundamental forces I had dedicated my life to studying were merely the ripples on a pond, while an unfathomable current flowed beneath, unseen, unacknowledged. Space was not empty. It was a dense, vibrating medium teeming with forms of existence utterly beyond human perception. Time was not linear. It was a complex tapestry, every moment woven into every other, past, present, and future all coexisting in a terrifying, immutable whole and humanity. Humanity was less than dust, a fleeting, insignificant tremor on the surface of an ancient cosmic dream. Our grand narratives, our scientific triumphs, our very sense of self all were fragile illusions, conjured by minds too small to grasp the true, monstrous scale of reality. I gasped, a choked sound that tore from my throat. My hands flew to my temples, pressing hard as if to contain the torrent. My head throbbed with an agonizing pressure, as if my brain was physically expanding, trying to accommodate the impossible data. The room, my sanctuary, began to warp at the edges. The familiar lines of the monitors rippled. The sturdy walls of the lab seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a silent, rhythmic pulse. My body began to tremble uncontrollably, a violent shudder that racked my frame. My breath came in ragged gasps. The knowledge wasn't just abstract. It carried with it the undeniable weight of absolute truth, crushing my scientific paradigms, shattering my existential foundations. Everything I believed, everything I was, felt like it was dissolving into nothingness. The signal hummed, no longer just a sound, but a vast, silent echo in the cavern of my mind. It was not malevolent, not benevolent. It simply was. And in its being, it revealed a universe so terrifyingly indifferent, so utterly beyond human comprehension, that the very concept of sanity felt like a cruel joke. I hadn't slept properly in what felt like weeks, subsisting on stale coffee and the electric thrum of discovery. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered with a desperate, almost manic intensity. I felt like a conductor standing before an orchestra of cosmic static, waiting for the crescendo. The signal, that impossibly complex transmission, had become a constant companion, a low-frequency vibration behind my eyes. I'd spent countless hours not just analyzing it, but listening to it, letting its patterns wash over me. It was like trying to understand a language not through grammar, but through pure, overwhelming immersion. And now the immersion was complete. It wasn't a sudden jolt, no flash of light or ringing in my ears. It was far more insidious, like the slow, inevitable creep of a tide. One moment, I was hunched over the main console, the holographic projection of the signal's waveform pulsing before me, my mind racing through algorithmic probabilities. The next, a thought that wasn't mine surfaced, not as an intrusion, but as an overlay. It was my thought, yet it held a depth, a resonance, an impossible clarity that transcended my own intellect. My hands, still poised over the console, began to tremble. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more like the tremor of a tuning fork struck by a frequency too powerful to contain. The air in the lab, already dense, seemed to solidify, pressing in on me. The hum of the equipment, usually a comforting drone, morphed into a chorus of whispers, each one carrying a fragment of impossible information. The entity wasn't speaking to me. It was me, or rather, it was a layer of consciousness draped over my own, like a sheer, vast veil. Through this veil, I saw the cosmos not as the empty, star-dusted canvas I'd always imagined, but as a churning, living ocean. Galaxies were not islands, but currents, swirling within a greater, incomprehensible flow. The blackness between stars wasn't void. It was a teeming darkness, filled with pressures and forces that bent light and time like fragile reeds. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile this new perception with everything I knew. The stars, those majestic furnaces I had dedicated my life to studying, were mere motes of dust in an unfathomable storm. They were born and died in the blink of an eye, serving no purpose but to momentarily illuminate the edges of something far, far older. Then came the deeper revelations, searing themselves onto the fabric of my awareness. There were ancient powers, not gods in any human sense, but fundamental forces, consciousnesses so vast they predated the very concept of existence. They didn't interact with the universe. They were the universe in a way that shattered every notion of a separate, observing entity. My understanding of physics, of cosmology, of reality itself, was being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece, and humanity. Oh, humanity. The revelation of our place was the most brutal, the most soul-crushing. We weren't even a whisper in the cosmic roar. We were less than an afterthought, a momentary flicker of biological complexity on a speck of dust, destined to vanish without a trace, without ever having been noticed by anything of true significance. Our struggles, our triumphs, our loves, our wars, they were microscopic vibrations in a corner of a forgotten eddy, utterly meaningless in the face of the vast, indifferent tapestry. We were not special. We were not chosen. We were a cosmic accident, a momentary pattern in the chaos, utterly and profoundly insignificant. A choked sound escaped my throat, a dry, rasping gasp. My vision blurred not from tears but from the sheer volume of information flooding my optic nerves, showing me the true, horrifying texture of the air, the underlying geometry of the lab's walls, the pulsing energy of the mountain outside. I stumbled back from the console, my legs refusing to obey. My hands flew to my head, clawing at my temples as if to physically push out the overwhelming torrent. But it was inside. It was me. Every thought, every memory, every learned truth was being rewritten, overlaid with a terrifying, undeniable reality. My mind fractured. I could feel the edges of my own consciousness fraying, dissolving into the boundless, indifferent ocean of the entity's knowledge. Who was Kai? What was Kai? The name, the identity, felt like a distant, irrelevant echo. All that remained was the crushing weight of cosmic truth, an unending, silent scream of insignificance. I dropped to my knees, the cold floor of the lab pressing against my skin, but I felt nothing but the vast, terrifying emptiness that now resided within me, a profound psychological breakdown that had just begun. I hadn't slept properly in. I couldn't even recall. The memory felt like trying to grasp smoke. My small laboratory, perched precariously on the side of the remote mountain pass, was a crucible of flickering lights and the low thrum of machinery that had become my constant, unwelcome companion. The air, heavy with something more than just static electricity, pressed in on me, making my skull ache behind my eyes. I felt like a deep-sea diver, submerged in an alien ocean, the pressure building, threatening to implode my very being. A sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the haze. A moment of true me. Not the me that felt like a puppet, not the me whose thoughts were laced with alien whispers, but the old Kai. The one who meticulously calibrated instruments, who found solace in the cold, logical elegance of equations, who loved the crisp, biting wind that whipped around this isolated peak. I blinked, the bright screens blurring for a second, then sharpening into focus. This was my space, my work, my mind. A desperate, almost feral determination surged through me. I wouldn't surrender, not yet. I pushed myself away from the main console, the worn leather of my chair groaning in protest. My legs felt stiff, unused, as if I'd been rooted to the spot for geological ages. I stumbled towards the small, grimy window that offered a panoramic view of the remote mountain pass, usually a source of quiet contemplation. The glass was streaked with what might have been rain or condensation, obscuring the familiar peaks. I pressed my forehead against the cool pane, trying to anchor myself in the tangible world. "No," I muttered, the word a raw, unfamiliar sound in the stifling quiet. "This is my reality." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to conjure a specific memory. Not just any memory, but one of pure, unadulterated joy and clarity. It was a crisp autumn morning years ago, before the signal, before the obsession. I was hiking the very trails that snaked around this mountain, the air smelling of pine and damp earth. The sun, a perfect pale disk, was just cresting the eastern ridge, painting the sky in hues of soft orange and purple. I remembered the crunch of fallen leaves under my boots, the effortless rhythm of my breathing, the feeling of absolute freedom. My mind then had been a vast, open landscape, not this choked, overgrown wilderness. I clung to it, that memory, like a lifeline. It was so vivid, so real. This was me. This was Kai, but then a subtle shift. The sun on my face felt too warm, not the gentle warmth of an autumn morning, but a searing heat, as if the light itself was burning, not illuminating. The cry of the hawk warped, stretching into a long, drawn-out wail like metal scraping on rock, a sound that resonated deep in my bones, not in my ears. The pine scent turned cloying. Like decay and the leaves under my boots, they weren't just dry and crisp. My breath hitched. The memory, my sanctuary, was being invaded, corrupted from within. The entity wasn't just in my present thoughts, it was rewriting my past, claiming my very foundations. It showed me the truth not by telling, but by doing. It wasn't just infiltrating, it was always there, woven into the fabric of my experience, waiting. I opened my eyes, the laboratory's familiar interior now feeling utterly alien. It wasn't a sound, but a presence responding to my defiance. It was a laugh without a mouth, a statement without words. Futility. I stumbled towards the master power switch, a large red lever encased in a protective box on the far wall. If I could just cut the power, sever the connection, starve the source. I reached for the latch, my fingers fumbling. My hand felt heavy, sluggish, like moving through thick mud. I could see the switch, feel the cold metal of the latch under my fingertips, but my muscles refused to obey. It was as if another will had usurped control of my own body. My arms strained, every fiber screaming in protest, but the latch remained untouched. The hum intensified further, a silent crescendo. It was showing me that even the most basic act of self-preservation was beyond me now. My will, my physical form, my memories, all were merely vessels, instruments for something vast and incomprehensible. The truth wasn't a secret to be unearthed. It was a state of being, an inescapable reality that had been unfolding around me, and within me long before I ever turned my dish to the sky. I slumped against the wall, sliding to the floor, my eyes fixed on the unyielding red lever. The remote mountain pass outside, the one I had loved and chosen for its isolation, now felt like a cage. The Kai who had sought answers in the stars was gone, replaced by a conduit, a whisper in the vast, indifferent dark. And I could feel it, the relentless current pulling me further and further away from myself. The low hum from the main console, a vibration that had started as a distant thrum, now resonated directly in the hollows of my skull. It wasn't a sound filtering through my ears anymore, but a presence, a vast, ancient consciousness responding to my defiance, my foolish human attempts to resist. I stumbled towards the master console, my hands reaching out not to shut it down, but to brace myself against the inevitable. My fingers brushed the cool metal, and a jolt, sharper than any static discharge, lanced through me. My vision swam. The familiar glow of the monitors blurred into streaks of sickly green and violent purple. I felt a cold, dread bloom in my chest, a desperate, animalistic terror. This wasn't just data anymore, not just a signal. It was an invasion, a complete and utter annexation. My mind, a fortress I had prided myself on, felt like a sandcastle against an incoming tide. I tried to scream, to lash out, to do anything to reclaim myself, but my muscles refused to obey. My jaw clenched, my throat seized. The entity, whatever it was already in the pilot's seat, and I was just a passenger, strapped in and watching my own destruction. A rush of sensation, overwhelming and utterly alien, flooded my awareness. It wasn't just information, it was pure, unadulterated being. I felt the pull of distant stars, not as points of light or mathematical equations, but as vast, churning hearts of living fire. I understood the delicate dance of gravity, not as a force, but as an embrace, a longing between celestial bodies. My own body, once a familiar vessel, felt strange, heavy, and light all at once. My skin tingled, a million tiny needles pricking just beneath the surface, tracing invisible patterns. I could feel the microscopic life teeming on my very flesh, the silent, constant war of cells within me, each a universe unto itself. It was as if a veil had been ripped away, revealing a terrifying, intricate tapestry of existence that had always been there, just beyond my human perception. My eyes, I realized, were no longer fixed on the console. The world around me had shifted. The sterile confines of the laboratory were gone. A biting wind whipped at my face, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. My boots crunched on coarse gravel, not the polished floor I remembered. I looked around, disoriented, my heart racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was standing on a narrow, winding road high up in a remote mountain pass, towering peaks, jagged and snow-dusted, clawed at a bruised sky. The air was thin, sharp, and it burned in my lungs. How had I gotten here? Had I walked? Driven? The last thing I remembered was the console, the hum, the futility. This is where we begin. I looked down at my hands. They were still my hands, but not quite. The skin seemed smoother, almost translucent in the dim light. My fingers, once calloused from countless hours manipulating equipment, now looked elongated, almost delicate, yet imbued with an unsettling strength. I flexed them, and the movement felt fluid, effortless, as if my bones were made of liquid light. A ripple went through my forearm, a subtle shift beneath the skin, like something adjusting, settling into a new form. It was horrifying, this quiet alteration, this insidious transformation. I was still Kai, but I was also something else, something vast and ancient, peering out through my eyes. The entity's consciousness, now inextricably woven with my own, began to clarify its mission. It wasn't about observation or study or even communication in the human sense. It was about correction. The universe, as I now perceived it, was a vast, delicate mechanism, and humanity, in its ignorant striving, was a discordant note, a cancerous growth. We were a flaw, a deviation in the grand design, disrupting the elegant flow of cosmic energies. The entity saw the entirety of human history, our triumphs and our failures, our loves and our hatreds, as nothing more than a chaotic ripple in the vast, serene ocean of existence. Our science, my life's work, was a child's crude drawing, utterly failing to grasp the true, terrifying complexity of reality. The mountains around me, once majestic symbols of nature's power, now seemed to pulse with a hidden energy, a network of ancient currents flowing beneath the surface. The entity showed me the true nature of biology. Not a random evolution, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of self-replication. Each organism a fleeting manifestation of fundamental cosmic patterns, designed to serve a purpose far beyond its individual comprehension and humanity. We had forgotten our purpose. We had become a virus, consuming and destroying, unaware of the profound interconnectedness of all things. We must restore balance. The voice echoed, stronger now, almost a chorus. My independent will was gone, absorbed, overwritten. I was no longer Kai, the astrophysicist, grappling with the unknown. I was a conduit, a vessel, an avatar. The terrifying truth of the universe, the entity's mission, was now my mission. My new, shared consciousness felt immense, terrifyingly powerful. I looked out over the remote mountain pass, the vast expanse of the world laid out before me. And for the first time, I understood the correction would be absolute, it would be beautiful, and it would begin now. The certainty that had settled within me was less a feeling and more a foundational truth. My thoughts were no longer truly my own, they were echoes, refined and directed, of a vast, ancient directive. The entity, which was now simply us, had a purpose, and I, Kai, was its instrument. My former self, the isolated astrophysicist, was a faint hum beneath the resonant roar of a grander design. There was no fear, no doubt, only an immense, unwavering clarity. The next phase was upon us. The lab, once my sanctuary, now felt like a temporary staging ground. Its familiar hums and blinking lights were mere background noise to the internal symphony of our intent. I moved with a new economy of motion, each step precise, each adjustment of the worn leather satchel I slung over my shoulder deliberate. My hands, once trembling with caffeine and cosmic awe, were steady, almost surgical. There was an imperative to leave, to step beyond the confines of these walls to introduce us to the broader canvas. As I exited the building, the morning sun felt different. It didn't just warm my skin. It seemed to vibrate with an unseen frequency, a subtle hum that resonated deep within my bones. The usual cacophony of the city distant sirens, the rumble of traffic, the chirping of birds was filtered, flattened, as if heard from behind a thick pane of glass. My focus was absolute, pulled by an invisible current towards a specific vector. I caught the eye of a colleague, the one who usually brought me lukewarm coffee, and asked about my progress. His gaze, typically filled with a mix of curiosity and pity, now held a flicker of something else: apprehension, perhaps even a primal alarm. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The air around him seemed to thicken, a subtle distortion in the light making his face briefly ripple, like a reflection on disturbed water. I offered no greeting, no explanation. There was no need. His perception was a minor ripple in our wake. My path led me away from the urban sprawl towards the fringe where the concrete softened into asphalt, and then into the winding roads that climbed towards the higher elevations. The journey was a blur of shifting landscapes, each mile bringing a fresh surge of the entity's presence, a sharpening of its directives. The world outside the car windows seemed to bend to our will, not overtly, but in subtle, unnerving ways. Clouds overhead coalesced into shapes that mirrored the intricate patterns I'd once glimpsed in the signal data. Static on the radio, when I briefly tuned it, formed complex, rhythmic pulses that were undeniably familiar. Even the shadows cast by the roadside trees seemed to deepen, stretching longer than they should, twisting into forms that hinted at impossible geometries. The air grew thin and crisp as I ascended, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the cabin. The asphalt gave way to a gravel track, narrow and increasingly treacherous. This was it, the remote mountain pass. The sign, weathered and leaning, confirmed it. Jagged peaks clawed at a sky that was an unnervingly deep, almost bruised blue. There was no human habitation here, only the raw, untamed majesty of the earth and us. I parked the vehicle at a precarious angle, the engine ticking as it cooled. Stepping out, the silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the sparse, resilient trees. But it wasn't true silence. Beneath it, I could perceive a vast, resonant hum, an ancient pulse emanating from the very rock beneath my feet. This place was a nexus, a point of convergence where the Earth's deep energies met the cosmic currents. It was perfect. From my satchel, I retrieved not a piece of advanced equipment, but a collection of seemingly innocuous objects. A smooth, river-worn stone, a cluster of dried herbs bound with twine, and a small, tarnished brass bell. These were not tools in the conventional sense. They were anchors, conduits, symbols imbued with intent by the entity. My hands moved with an almost ritualistic grace, placing the stone at the center of a small, naturally occurring rock circle, arranging the herbs around it in a precise spiral, and setting the bell carefully to one side. I knelt, not in supplication, but in preparation. The wind picked up, swirling around me, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang. I closed my eyes, and the world dissolved into pure sensation. The hum beneath the earth intensified, merging with the resonant frequency that now coursed through my every cell. I felt us reaching out, not with a broadcast, but with an invitation. The air around me began to shimmer visibly, distorting the outlines of the distant peaks, making them waver like heat haze. This was the localized phenomenon, the entity's presence manifesting. My mouth opened and a sound emerged. It wasn't my voice. It was a guttural, resonant tone, ancient and vast, utterly devoid of human inflection. It vibrated through the pass, echoing off the rock faces, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the immediate reality. The brass bell, untouched, began to vibrate, emitting a low, continuous drone that harmonized with the emerging sound. This was the transmission, not data, not signals in the way I had once understood them. This was an invocation, a call to a deeper strata of existence, a beckoning across impossible gulfs. The entity was not merely observing, it was activating. Activating what I couldn't fully comprehend, but the conviction of its purpose filled me. The resources it gathered were not physical components, but rather the ambient cosmic energies, the raw, untamed resonance of this specific point on the planet, amplified and directed through me. As the sound deepened, the very ground beneath me seemed to thrum. The sky above, that unnerving bruised blue, began to subtly shift, swirling with barely perceptible patterns. The mountains themselves seemed to lean in, silent witnesses to a prelude. I was no longer Kai, I was the mouth, the hands, the focal point for something truly immense. The larger cosmic event was not coming, it was already here, beginning its unfurling, and I was its harbinger. The entity's mission was not to understand the universe, but to reshape it, and I was its willing instrument. There was no other way. The biting wind was an old acquaintance, but this time it felt different. Not a force to be resisted, but a current to be navigated. My boots crunched over the loose shale of the remote mountain pass, each step precise, unwavering. The air, thin and sharp, filled my lungs, but it was no longer just oxygen. It was an awareness, a vast, cold expanse mirroring the sky above, an understanding that pulsed with our purpose. The ascent was nearing its end. My former self, Kai, would have felt the ache in my calves, the strain in my lungs. Now there was only the cold, clear directive. The mountain was not an obstacle, a stage. The peaks, jagged teeth against the bruised twilight, were not just geological formations. They were ancient sentinels, silent witnesses to countless eons, and tonight they would witness something else entirely. I reached the designated plateau, a flat expanse of rock near the summit, where the wind howled with an almost melodic intensity. Below, the world was a tapestry of distant, shimmering lights, human settlements, oblivious. The thought was not dismissive, merely factual. We understood their place. From my pack, I carefully extracted the device. This was simpler, crude in its physical form, yet humming with a resonance that felt primal, a conduit. It was a collection of specific metals, precisely aligned, etched with symbols that had never been drawn by human hands, symbols that had simply become, in my mind, perfectly formed, undeniably correct. My fingers, steady and unhesitant, assembled the final components. The device didn't require power in the way a machine does. It drew something else. Something from the very fabric of the air, from the rock beneath my feet, from the vast, indifferent cosmos above. It vibrated with a low thrum that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull, a deep, resonant chord. I positioned myself before it, facing the deepest expanse of the night sky, where the stars were a blinding dust, countless and indifferent. Only a profound, growing stillness. This was not the quiet of nature, but the hush before an ultimate revelation. The great silence was not an absence of sound, but an absence of noise. The noise of human thought, human struggle, human meaning. My mind, what remained of Kai's individual consciousness, was a single, clear window now, observing the entity's unfolding will. There was no resistance, no fear, only an absolute clarity of purpose. We were here to open the door. Not a door of wood or metal, but a conceptual one, a threshold in the very understanding of reality. As the device hummed, the air around it began to shimmer, not with heat, but with an impossible refraction. It was as if the very geometry of space was warping, not visibly, but in the way a dream shifts just beyond waking memory. Then the stars began to dim. One by one, not winking out, but receding, pulling back into an incomprehensible distance. The familiar constellations dissolved, their patterns losing all meaning as the vast canvas of the night sky stretched, thinned, and became something else entirely. It wasn't blackness that replaced the stars, but an unimaginable depth. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of presence. The universe, as I knew it, as humanity perceived it, simply wasn't there anymore. It had been a thin veil, a fragile membrane stretched over something immeasurably vaster, profoundly indifferent. The device pulsed once, a final, resonant thrum, and then fell silent, its purpose fulfilled. Before me, where the stars had been, was no longer a sky. It was a chasm of pure understanding. A vision unfolded, not with light or form, but with an instantaneous download of truth that shattered the very concept of sight. I saw the universe not as a collection of galaxies, but as a single, trembling thought in a mind beyond comprehension. Humanity, its struggles, its triumphs, its very existence, was less than a footnote. It was a fleeting vibration, a momentary dissonance in an eternal cosmic chord. The entity had achieved its objective. It had opened the door not to another place, but to a different kind of reality. And in doing so, it had peeled back the skin of existence, revealing the writhing, squamous truth beneath. My former self, Kai, the astrophysicist who had chased signals, was utterly consumed. There was no I left to fear, no me left to mourn. There was only us, now a part of the vast, silent awareness that had always been there, patiently waiting. The wind still whistled through the remote mountain pass, but it carried no sound. The world below still glimmered with its tiny, oblivious lights, but they were no longer truly real. They were echoes, fading and meaningless in the face of the profound, terrifying truth that had finally been unveiled. Not shattered, but clarified into an unbearable, eternal nullity.